Imagine a nation where winter feels endless and entire communities once measured prosperity by the size of the fish catch and the length of the logging season. For generations, survival meant endurance rather than ambition. Then quietly, without spectacle, that same nation became a silent owner of the global economy, holding assets worth trillions of dollars across continents. Yet the engine behind that wealth remains oil and gas at the very moment the world claims it is moving beyond fossil fuels. This is not a fairy tale about virtue or luck. It is a disciplined bargain. Norway exports energy, exports the money, and buys a future in global assets. The country treated oil not as a miracle to celebrate, but as a force capable of destabilizing everything it touched. Where others rushed to spend, Norway paused to build distance. The story begins with a trap that has destroyed countless resource-rich nations and with a decision to treat wealth as something dangerous long before it ever felt safe. The next section defines that trap and explains why Norway chose restraint before prosperity made restraint politically impossible. To understand why Norway behaves so differently, the analysis must begin with a pattern that has repeated across continents and decades. Economists call it the resource curse. It describes a paradox where countries rich in oil, gas, or minerals often grow slower, become more unequal, and suffer weaker institutions than countries with fewer natural gifts. Easy money arrives faster than governance can adapt. Governments rely less on taxing citizens and more on rents drawn directly from the ground. When leaders no longer depend on taxpayers, accountability weakens and power concentrates quietly. Closely linked to this curse is a second mechanism known as Dutch disease. When a resource boom attracts foreign capital, the national currency strengthens. A stronger currency makes other exports more expensive and less competitive. Manufacturing shrinks, skills erode, and workers migrate toward the booming sector. The economy narrows. In practical terms, this means factories close not because they are inefficient, but because their costs rise faster than global prices will tolerate. Most countries learn this lesson too late. Venezuela used oil to finance consumption rather than capability. Nigeria used oil to entrench political control rather than institutions. Russia used oil to rebuild state power while hollowing out competition. In each case, early prosperity masked long-term fragility. By the time warning signs appeared, dependence was already locked in. What makes the Norwegian case different is timing. Oil was discovered before serious revenues arrived, but after the country had already built a functioning social contract. Taxes were accepted, public institutions were trusted, long-term planning was politically possible. Norway did not begin rich, it began organized. That difference mattered more than the oil itself. There was also a structural constraint. Norway is a small, open economy exposed to global shocks. Rapid inflation or a surging currency would have damaged livelihoods quickly. Leaders understood that oil wealth could destabilize the very stability citizens valued most. From the beginning, oil was framed not as a blessing to celebrate, but as a force to control. Here lies the central conceptual shift. Norway treated oil revenue as capital rather than income. Income is meant to be spent. Capital is meant to be preserved. Once this distinction was accepted, the logic of the entire system followed. Who controlled extraction, how profits were taxed, where the money was stored, and how far it needed to be kept from daily politics. This framing explains why Norway moved slowly when others rushed. It explains why restraint was defended even during downturns. And it explains why the next step was not how to spend oil money, but how to prevent it from being spent at all. The analysis now turns to the first concrete decision that locked this mindset into policy and shifted the balance of power from the very beginning. When oil was confirmed beneath the North Sea, Norway faced a choice that would define everything that followed. Move fast and get rich quickly, or move slowly and keep control. Most countries choose speed. Norway chose ownership. At the time, this decision looked inefficient. International oil companies had the rigs, the engineers, and the experience. Norway had rough seas, limited expertise, and a small bureaucracy. Selling access cheaply would have delivered immediate revenue and short-term political approval. It also would have transferred long-term power to foreign firms. Norway refused that trade. The state declared that all petroleum resources on its continental shelf belonged to the Norwegian people. This was not symbolic language. It was enforced through law, licensing, and taxation. Foreign companies were invited to participate, but only under strict conditions. They could drill, but they could not dominate. They could profit, but they could not dictate terms. The creation of a state-controlled oil company anchored this approach. State oil was not designed simply to generate profit. It was designed to absorb knowledge. Every partnership with a foreign firm required technology transfer training and operational transparency. Norway used access to its oil as leverage to build domestic competence. Oil was the bait. Expertise was the prize. Taxation reinforced the same principle. Petroleum profits were taxed at levels far higher than in most industries. The logic was blunt. These profits did not come from superior entrepreneurship alone. They came from a national resource. Extraordinary rents would therefore be captured by the public. Oil companies protested. Most stayed. The geology was too attractive to ignore. This slow, controlled approach reshaped power dynamics early. Negotiation replaced dependency. Projects advanced deliberately rather than aggressively. Costs were higher. Timelines were longer, but ownership extended beyond barrels extracted. Norway owned the rules, the data, and the learning curve. The most important consequence was political. By asserting sovereignty at the beginning, Norway reduced the risk that oil would become either a private windfall or a political slush fund. The resource was made boring, procedural, and bureaucratic. That boredom was intentional. It created distance between wealth and authority. Yet sovereignty alone does not prevent failure. Many states nationalized resources only to collapse under mismanagement. Control creates temptation as easily as it creates protection. The next chapter explains how Norway prevented sovereignty from turning into political capture once the money began to arrive. Sovereignty secured control over oil. Discipline determined whether that control would endure. History shows that national ownership alone does not prevent collapse. In many cases, it accelerates it. Once money flows directly into the hands of the state, the temptation to spend becomes overwhelming. Norway anticipated this danger and built defenses before the sums became politically irresistible. The first defense was separation. Oil revenues were never treated like ordinary tax income. They were accounted for independently and removed from the annual political budget cycle. Visibility creates pressure. When money appears to belong to the present, it invites promises. When it is placed at a distance, it invites calculation. The second defense was delegation. Management of oil wealth was assigned to institutions designed to outlast election cycles. Economists, central bankers, and career civil servants stood between politicians and the money. Their mandate was narrow and technical: preserve value, manage risk, and think in decades rather than terms. Politicians could set rules, but they could not direct spending or select winners. The most powerful defense was the fiscal rule. The state committed to spending only the expected long-term real return of accumulated wealth, rather than the wealth itself. This converted moral restraint into arithmetic. Every additional krone spent today could be traced directly to a smaller balance tomorrow. Debate shifted away from generosity and toward consequence. This rule was not symbolic. It was tested during downturns and moments of stress. Unemployment rose, pressure mounted, voices demanded larger withdrawals. Each time the rule held. Not because it was painless, but because breaking it would have signaled that no limit was truly binding. Once that signal is sent, it cannot be recalled. Institutional discipline reshaped political incentives. Proposing to raid long-term savings carried reputational cost. Parties learned that short-term generosity, financed by future wealth, was interpreted as irresponsibility rather than compassion. Over time, the electorate itself became an informal enforcer of restraint. This alignment between institutions, politicians, and voters is rare. It depends on trust in competence and fairness. Without that trust, rules become empty promises. With it, they become durable constraints. Discipline achieved one more outcome that is often overlooked. It forced Norway to confront a final question early. If the money could not be spent at home, where should it go? The answer would redefine the structure of the economy for decades. Once Norway accepted that oil revenue could not be spent freely at home, a more radical decision followed. The money had to leave the country, not temporarily, systematically. Allowing oil income to circulate domestically would have strengthened the currency, pushed up wages, and slowly suffocated non-oil industries. Manufacturing, fisheries, and services would have become uncompetitive. This was Dutch disease in slow motion. Norway chose prevention over repair. Every major stream of petroleum revenue was therefore transferred abroad and invested in foreign markets. Stocks, bonds, and real estate became the destination of oil income. By exporting the money, Norway neutralized inflationary pressure before it could take hold. Domestic demand remained stable. Wage growth stayed gradual. The broader economy retained balance. This decision transformed a finite physical resource into a diversified financial engine. Oil prices are volatile. Markets fluctuate but compound over long horizons. Norway was converting geological luck into financial permanence. The country no longer depended on how much oil remained underground. It depended on the performance of the global economy itself. There was also a political logic behind distance. Money invested abroad is harder to claim emotionally. It does not fund visible projects or local monuments. It cannot be promised easily during campaigns. Distance dulls temptation. By keeping wealth offshore, Norway reduced the intensity of domestic pressure to spend. Externalization created a second-order effect. Norway became a quiet owner of global capital. Office buildings, infrastructure, and companies across continents generated income for a small Nordic state. Energy exports funded ownership. Ownership generated influence. Norway shifted from exporting resources to holding long-term stakes in global capitalism. This structure carried risk. Market crashes, geopolitical shocks, and prolonged periods of low returns could all affect public finances. Norway accepted these risks deliberately. Exposure to markets it could not control was safer than exposure to temptations it could not resist. Externalizing wealth solved one problem but raised another. Distance protects money from politics. It does not protect society from complacency. With stability secured, a more subtle challenge emerged. Why did this system hold across generations, and what happens when memory of scarcity fades? Rules and institutions explain how Norway managed oil wealth, but they do not fully explain why the system survived political pressure year after year. Many countries design elegant frameworks and abandon them the first time unemployment rises. What protected the Norwegian model was not law alone, but culture. Before oil, Norway was already a high-trust society. Taxes were not viewed as theft, but as contribution. Public institutions were imperfect, but broadly legitimate. Citizens expected the state to act competently, and the state expected citizens to accept limits. Oil wealth entered a system where cooperation already existed rather than replacing it. Historical memory mattered. The generation that designed the oil framework had lived through scarcity rationing and post-war reconstruction. Older Norwegians still remember waiting lists, ration cards, and years when saving was not a virtue but a necessity. Oil money arrived within living memory of hardship. Spending everything immediately would not have felt generous. It would have felt reckless. This attitude shaped everyday behavior. Oil money was rarely discussed as personal entitlement. It was framed as belonging to the nation across time. Children were taught that the fund existed for people not yet born. Touching it was described not as stimulus, but as borrowing from the future. Political incentives adjusted accordingly. Proposals to break fiscal rules were not rewarded with votes. They were met with suspicion. Leaders who suggested dipping into long-term savings were accused of impatience rather than ambition. Over time, restraint itself became a form of political credibility. There was also a quieter trade-off. Comfort softened urgency. When safety nets are strong and futures feel secure, the pressure to innovate weakens. Norway accepted this risk knowingly. Stability was prioritized over disruption. The cost was slower innovation outside energy. The benefit was social cohesion and predictability. This balance held because the society remembered why the rules existed. The danger ahead is generational. As memory of scarcity fades, discipline becomes harder to defend. A system built on trust must continuously renew the story that justifies restraint. With culture reinforcing rules, the Norwegian model appeared complete. But no system exists in isolation. Its strengths and weaknesses become clearer when placed beside countries that made different choices with similar resources. Norway's strategy only becomes fully visible when placed beside countries that discovered similar resources and made different choices. The contrast is not about intelligence or morality. It is about incentives, discipline, and timing. Consider Alberta in Canada. The geology was generous and the political system was stable, yet oil revenue was largely treated as current income. Taxes were kept low, spending expanded, and saving remained secondary. When prices rose, budgets followed. When prices fell, deficits appeared. The resource paid for comfort, but not insulation. Volatility became structural rather than accidental. The United Kingdom offers a second contrast. North Sea oil revenues flowed rapidly into the domestic economy through tax relief consumption and budget support. The boom softened decline but did not create a permanent financial anchor. When production peaked and then fell, the cushion disappeared. Decades of extraction produced little enduring national capital. Venezuela represents the extreme case. Oil revenue became the foundation of political power rather than institutional strength. Consumption replaced investment. Patronage replaced accountability. When prices collapsed, production followed, and the system imploded. The curse was not oil itself, but the absence of restraint. Norway rejected each of these outcomes by sacrificing speed. It saved when others spent. It slowed when others rushed. This choice reduced short-term political rewards but maximized long-term resilience. Unlike petrostates that used energy wealth to project power, Norway used it to withdraw from volatility. These decisions reshaped Norway's international role. After the energy shock triggered by the war in Ukraine, Norway emerged as Europe's most reliable supplier of natural gas. Production increased, revenues surged, and political pressure followed. Some European leaders accused Norway of profiting from crisis. Norway responded that contracts were honored and prices were set by markets. The tension revealed a deeper reality. Norway was no longer a marginal producer. It had become a structural stabilizer in a fragile energy system. This position carries consequences. Energy exports fund the sovereign wealth portfolio. That portfolio owns stakes in companies across the world. Norway influences corporate behavior through ownership while remaining a fossil fuel exporter. It occupies a dual role as moral investor and carbon supplier. Credibility and contradiction coexist. The domestic consequences are equally complex. The fund finances a significant share of public services without requiring equivalent taxation. Stability increases, conflict decreases, but incentives soften. Innovation outside energy lags behind Nordic peers such as Sweden, which produced global technology champions, while Norway prioritized predictability. International comparison reveals the core trade-off. Norway did not eliminate risk. It selected it. It traded growth volatility for exposure to global markets. It traded political discretion for institutional rigidity. It traded disruption for endurance. These choices built a fortress against collapse. They did not guarantee renewal. The final question is whether a system designed to prevent failure can also generate momentum in a world that is changing faster than the rules that once protected it. The challenge Norway faces now is not how to survive abundance, but how to evolve beyond it. The system that protected the country from the resource curse was built for an era of extraction. The next era will test whether that same discipline can support transformation rather than merely preserve stability. The first task is economic transition. Oil and gas will remain important for years, but their strategic dominance will decline. Norway does not need to abandon its energy expertise. It needs to redeploy it. Offshore engineering, maritime logistics, and large-scale energy management can be redirected toward offshore wind carbon capture, hydrogen infrastructure, and long-duration storage. The capability already exists. What is missing is urgency. The question is not whether Norway can afford to change, but whether comfort delays the moment change becomes unavoidable. The second task is demographic pressure. An aging population will increase welfare costs while reducing the active workforce. The Sovereign Wealth Fund can absorb part of this burden, but it cannot replace reform. Higher labor participation later in life, targeted skilled immigration, and productivity gains in health and public services are essential. The fund can finance aging, but it cannot replace people. The third task is financial exposure. By externalizing wealth, Norway tied its future to global markets. Over decades, this strategy has worked. Over shorter horizons, it creates vulnerability. Prolonged downturns, geopolitical shocks, or sustained low returns would directly affect public budgets. The solution is not political intervention in investment decisions, but continued diversification, transparency, and professional distance. The moment investment strategy becomes a political tool, the logic of the system breaks. There is also a geopolitical dimension. Norway will remain a critical energy supplier to Europe as long as gas is needed. Using this position responsibly while accelerating domestic transition is a delicate balance. Selling energy today to fund the exit tomorrow is not hypocrisy if the exit is real. The danger lies in postponement justified by comfort. The most difficult risk is psychological. A society that has never experienced collapse may underestimate it. Discipline without fear requires narrative. Leaders must continuously explain why restraint still matters when money feels abundant. A system designed to prevent collapse must still answer one question: how does it create hunger without fear? In the best scenario, Norway becomes the first resource state to complete a full transition from extraction to stewardship. In the worst, it drifts, relying on financial returns while innovation slows. The outcome will not be decided by geology or markets, but by choices made long after the oil was found. The final section draws the lesson clearly and asks what this story means beyond one country. Norway is often presented as proof that the resource curse can be defeated. That story is comforting, but incomplete. Norway did not eliminate the curse. It contained it. Oil wealth was treated as something powerful and potentially destructive, rather than something to celebrate. Money was placed at a distance. Rules were designed to assume human weakness, rather than deny it. This approach produced extraordinary stability. It created one of the largest financial reserves ever accumulated by a democracy. It funded public services without hollowing out the broader economy. It reduced political conflict and bought time. But time is not immunity. Norway now faces a different test. Oil revenues will not disappear tomorrow, but they will fade. Financial markets will not rise forever. Demographic pressures will grow. The discipline that once protected the country from greed must now protect it from drift. The danger ahead is not collapse, but stagnation disguised as security. The deeper lesson is not about oil or even Norway. It is about incentives. Show people where costs fall and behavior follows. Remove consequences and even the best systems decay. Norway succeeded because it constrained power, separated money from politics, and forced long-term trade-offs to be made early. Norway's greatest resource was never oil. It was the decision to treat oil as a problem to manage rather than a miracle to spend. The open question is whether this mindset can survive comfort. Can restraint endure when memory of scarcity fades? Can a system built to prevent failure also generate momentum in a world that rewards speed? These questions matter far beyond one Nordic country. They apply wherever money arrives faster than institutions can adapt and wherever societies must choose between immediate relief and long-term resilience. If you want to continue exploring how wealth, power, and incentives quietly shape outcomes decades before anyone realizes they were decided, consider staying with this series, sharing the discussion, and examining the next case together.